So I'm going to talk today about the December Elective Conference and the future of South Africa. And the ANC Elective Conference, which took place from the 16th to the 20th of December last year, was perhaps the most anticipated ANC conference since the party took power in 1994. After several years of factional infighting, repeated attempts to impeach President Jacob Zuma, and rampant allegations of state capture, the stakes were high as the ANC gathered to elect its new leadership. In this briefing, I'm going to briefly explore both the political and policy outcomes of the conference itself, before moving on to look at what this is likely to mean for South Africa in the run-up to the 2019 national elections, with a particular focus on politics, foreign policy, security, economics, the opposition parties, and the 2019 elections. So to begin with the politics. As I mentioned, the conference was perhaps the most anticipated ANC conference since the party took power, and the run-up to the conference revealed a deeply divided party. On the one side were the so-called patronage faction, those loyal to Zuma who endorse socially conservative, highly redistributive policies. They're paternalistic in approach, they favour a centralised state, heavily involved in patronage networks, central to the state capture allegations, widely seen as corrupt and associated with the Dlamini Zuma campaign for ANC president. On the other side, we had the reformers, led by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa. This group of ANC members are predominantly urban-based. They're committed to inclusive social growth, generally pro-business, and in general, they're anti-patronage and excluded from most of the state capture allegations. And the campaigning had been fierce for any of you who followed it in the media, and the final weeks saw a number of important setbacks for Jacob Zuma and his preferred successor, his ex-wife, Dlamini Zuma. So first of all, a branch poll in late November put Ramaphosa in the lead, meaning he headed into the conference itself with the all-important momentum. Public opinion surveys also repeatedly indicated that Cyril Ramaphosa was significantly more popular, both within the ANC and nationally, and that an ANC led by him was likely to do much better at the 2019 elections. On December 13th, so just days before the start of this conference, Judge Dunstan Mlambo ordered Jacob Zuma to personally pay the costs of his failed attempt to halt the release of the State of Capture report. The President was also instructed to implement the remedial action set out in this report and to appoint a commission of inquiry into state capture within 30 days. And crucially for the Dlamini Zuma campaign and for the legitimacy of Jacob Zuma within the country, he was told that the inquiry was not to be headed by a judge that he'd chosen, which would be normal with with a commission of inquiry, but it had to be led by a judge appointed by the Chief Justice. So this really undermined Jacob Zuma's legitimacy going into this conference. The day before the conference, and if any of you were following it, I was out in Cape Town at the time, the media stories were coming thick and fast. So the day before the conference, the High Court in Pretoria also set aside Zuma's appointment of Sean Abrahams as the National Director of the National Prosecuting Authority. And again, really undermining Jacob Zuma in this, he ruled that the Deputy President, so Cyril Ramaphosa, one of the kind of opposition candidate, if you like, in the upcoming elections, was the one who should appoint the new National Director. Okay, so they took that power away from the President and gave it to the Deputy President, which elevated Cyril Ramaphosa still further. It also increased the likelihood of Zuma facing charges related to the 783 charges of corruption, fraud, racketeering and money laundering that have been hanging over his head for almost a decade at this point. And finally, once we've gone through all of this, a number of branch issues at the very last minute also complicated things going into this elective conference. There were numerous legal challenges in the final days, and even hours, and the delegates from 3 areas of the country were prevented from holding voting status at the conference, following court rulings just the day before the conference started. And crucially, all of these 3 areas were believed to be aligned to the Dlamini Zuma campaign. So KwaZulu-Natal, the Pietermaritzburg High Court dissolved the election of Zikalala and his Provincial Executive Committee, preventing the 27-member executive who'd been vocally in support of the Dlamini Zuma campaign from participating in the conference. In the Northwest, the regional conference held on September 24th was nullified, so again they were not able to participate in the voting. And in the Free State, the Bloemfontein High Court ruled that the ANC Free State Provincial Conference, which had just been held earlier that week and re-elected provincial chairperson Ace Magashule, was invalid. And then as the conference started, we had the usual question of bogus delegates. So anybody who follows ANC politics, these appear every elective conference. Quite a lot of them are dead, but they managed to get on the ballot somehow. So there were lots of accreditation challenges, which actually spilled over into the second day of the conference. So before we'd even started with what we knew was going to be a contested election, we had all sorts of problems with delegates, and it just seemed to be going against Dlamini Zuma's campaign again and again. Eventually, however, the conference did get underway, and the elections of the top 6 were held. So the NEC, the National Executive Committee, has 86 members. And the way that the ANC hold their elections, the top 6, so these 6 positions here, are elected first, and then the remaining 80 are elected. The most dramatic moment of voting came, I would argue, from the Mpumalanga delegation, who actually went in to cast their votes singing songs in support of Dlamini Zuma, and then came out shortly afterwards singing songs in support of Ramaphosa, claiming that they'd been touched by the Holy Spirit in the voting room. So there was lots and lots of drama around it. It went on for a full day longer than it should have done before we got the results. And that was in part because voting just took a very long time, but there were also demands for recounts, which I'll talk about briefly. But finally we got these results. So as you can see, I've got the reformers are in green, and the patronage faction are in blue here. So as you can see, the top 6 reflect an organisation that is effectively divided straight down the middle. You've got 3 from the patronage faction, and you've got 3 from the reformers faction, and the rest of the NEC, the remaining 80 members, were similarly divided. Ramaphosa, who came out as president, won by an incredibly narrow margin of just 179 votes. So he got 2,440 votes to Dlamini Zuma's 2,261. And that was far, far lower than he was predicted. That's likely in part because Dlamini Zuma was supported by some of the bigger branches. So the polls that had been done in the run-up were branch polls, so we kind of had a sense of how the branches were going to go. But large branches with more than 250 members, get a second vote. So some of that is likely because she had the bigger branches, but also undoubtedly because of last-minute trading and vote buying. And I would actually argue that this mixed slate was inevitable. I think it was the only way the ANC was going to get a result that would stand and not split the party. And in the run-up to the elections and, as I'll discuss shortly, post the elections, unity in the party has been absolutely crucial for the ANC. I think the results also suggest a deal between power brokers rather than the will of the branches, which is what the official ANC claim is. 2 of these elections in particular, I think, are concerning for anyone hoping for significant reform in the ANC. So the first is Didi Mabuza, or David Mabuza, who emerged as deputy president. For those of you who don't know him, and he was sort of known and sort of unknown, in the last 2 weeks, there were a lot of articles in South African newspapers saying, who is David Mabuza? He's always been in politics, but he's not been a big power player on the national stage. Up until now. He's the Mpumalanga Premier, and he really positioned himself very nicely in these elections. So in the November branch poll, the final poll before the elections, almost half of the branches in Mpumalanga voted for a unity slate. So instead of voting for the people that were saying that they were going to vote based on the people that were on the ballot, they crossed them out and wrote unity. And that was apparently done on instructions from Mabuza. And it really positioned him as an effective kingmaker. So in the final sort of 2-3 weeks before the elections, he was being courted. He was being flown all over the place. People wanted to be meeting with him because he'd shown that he had the ability to deliver almost half the votes from Mpumalanga, which in a tight race was always going to be important. As I said, the Mpumalanga delegates also made a very public show of switching support at the conference. It's not necessary. If they were always going to vote Ramaphosa, they could have gone in singing Ramaphosa songs and come out singing Ramaphosa songs. If they genuinely changed their mind, they could have done it a little bit quietly. But it provided a very public display of Mabuza's power. It ensured that after that had happened, every story in the media was about David Mabuza and his ability to get the delegates to switch and to move from Dlamini Zuma to Ramaphosa. And the moment was effectively Mabuza claiming credit for Ramaphosa's election. And part of the reason that I think his election is concerning is that he is undoubtedly going to demand later payment for this. And because of his own views, because of his own alliances with the patronage faction, I think that's likely to severely hamper some of Ramaphosa's reformist goals. David Mabuza also won by the biggest margin. So he's really, although Cyril Ramaphosa's at the top of this list, he's really come out as the popular, the strong candidate. In terms of, I said that I think some of his policies are concerning. He's presided over tender irregularities and a mafia-style governance in Mpumalanga. And he's also accused of running a private army to keep ANC branches in line. So around the time of the elections, there was a lot of uproar on Twitter over thugs apparently instructed by David Mabuza to go in to disrupt branch meetings by firing guns up in the air in residential areas and that sort of thing. He's also long been engulfed in numerous political scandals, including corruption and assassinations. And all of this raises concerns, as I said, both for Ramaphosa, but I think also looking beyond Ramaphosa for the country more broadly, because Mabuza is undoubtedly gunning for the top spot in future, and I think he's shown that he's got the political savvy to get there if he wants to. The second of the two that I think is concerning is the Secretary General, that's Ace Magashule. And some of you may know his election as Secretary General was highly controversial in the conference itself, and it seems the most likely of all of the top 6 to have had some sort of direct interference. Senzo Mchunu, who was against Ace Magashule for this spot, and Mchunu is allied to the Ramaphosa slate, he eventually lost by a very slim margin, so 24 votes later reduced to 9, but that was following 2 recounts which seemed to show the votes going one way and then the other, and an alleged 68 missing votes. Like Mabuza, Magashule is heavily implicated in corruption and associated with the patronage faction in the ANC. He's also closely tied to the Gupta family, so his son, along with President Zuma's son, have worked for the Guptas. And he's been embroiled in repeated legal battles and allegations of corruption over the years. He's also the longest-serving ANC provincial premier, so he's been involved in politics for a long time. And a comment I really liked that came out at the time from a journalist in South Africa was the Free State PEC was unable to participate in 2 consecutive ANC national conferences due to corruption and mismanaged conferences. The man in charge of that province, Ace Magashule, is now responsible for managing the entire ANC and the ANC's election campaign. So I think there's real reasons to be concerned about those 2 elections in particular. Moving on now to look at the policy. So that was the kind of main political outcomes. But looking now at the policy. For the most part, these policy outcomes didn't show any great change in direction. The ANC Elective Conference largely endorsed the July policy conference resolutions with a few additions and tweaks. And here I'm just going to look at a selection of the most important announcements. So some of these are new, some of these are slightly tweaked from July, but most of them are in the same vein as we've had before. Perhaps the biggest shock, and this was an announcement we weren't expecting, was fee-free higher education. The announcement was made on Saturday morning, a few hours ahead of the conference, when President Zuma announced it in an official statement. And he announced that the government will introduce fully subsidised free higher education and training for poor and working class undergraduate students. This was a key plank of the Dlamini Zuma campaign and was likely done to try and boost her campaign in its final hours. It's created huge questions for Ramaphosa now coming in around funding. There's an estimated bill in 2018 alone of 12.4 billion rand. It came as a shock to the universities who had no idea this announcement was going to make, and many in the ANC and government. It was actually made at the same time as the finance minister was giving another speech and effectively undermined everything the finance minister said. It also overruled key recommendations of the Commission into the feasibility of fee-free higher education that Zuma himself had appointed. And sources in the ANC have since indicated that Finance Minister Gigaba had pleaded with Zuma not to make this announcement and to hold it until the State of the Nation address in February 2018. So this policy announcements left Cyril Ramaphosa with a very hot issue to deal with right out of the gate, and I think it gives some indication of the sort of problems Zuma could create if he is not removed from his position and continues as president of the country until the 2019 elections. If he's going to stand up and make announcements that nobody knows is coming, that his own cabinet are trying to warn him and stop him doing, I think it raises some serious questions there. Another key policy announcement was about the expropriation of land without compensation. So this is a decision to start the process towards a constitutional amendment to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation. It was perhaps the most hotly contested debate of the conference. Then Secretary General Gwede Mantashe apparently had to step in as chair for a while of the group debating this, and the two sides apparently almost came to physical blows over this issue. The caveat that's been put on this, which I think is positive, is that it should not undermine the economy, agricultural production and food security. So it's widely seen as a win for the Dlamini Zuma state. Expropriation of land without compensation is something she really wanted, and Ramaphosa's allies were generally opposed to it. But I think the caveat gives them an effective way out. I'm not sure, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, how much implementation we're actually going to see. I think we're going to see a lot of rhetoric around this, but I think they've got a sort of get out of jail free caveat put in, and I'm not sure how much implementation we're going to see between now and 2019. The third is the rollback of authority of traditional leaders over communal land. And the goal here is to eventually give communities 13% of land. This is actually a big shift from the Zuma-dominated era, under which the ANC has largely tried to curry favour with traditional leaders. It's been heavily pushed for by groups including COSATU and the SACP, and it's likely to be strongly resisted by traditional authorities, perhaps unsurprisingly. It's of particular importance to the mining industry, and a lot of the new mining that's going on in the Eastern Cape, companies are likely to find that they're now going to have to negotiate with more people around land access and use. So rather than just being able to negotiate with the chief and get access to the land, it's likely you're now going to have to negotiate with slightly more. But that's likely to take some time, and it is only 13% of the land. Then we had a commitment and a restatement of the commitment to radical socio-economic transformation. Again, in some ways, this looks like a pro-Dlamini Zuma result. It was a cornerstone of her campaign. But again, we have a caveat that I think makes it more palatable to the Ramaphosa side, placing it in the context of inclusive growth. So radical social economic transformation, as long as it doesn't undermine inclusive growth. Corruption was a big hope for Ramaphosa's statement at the end of the conference, but not too many details emerged here. We had a promise to establish an accountability framework to ensure ethical leadership, but that was about it. And the limited details are perhaps unsurprising, given the split slate and the need to focus on unity. But it's hugely disappointing. I think tackling corruption is one of the biggest tasks facing Ramaphosa, and the fact he didn't come out of the gate swinging on this one raises some suspicions that he's likely to be hamstrung as he goes forward, I think partly by the narrow margin of victory and partly by the real need to focus on unity and to hold the party together in the run-up to 2019. And finally, we had the nationalisation of the South African Reserve Bank. Again, this isn't a new policy, but the final decision on the matter was taken, and the ANC has now instructed government to begin the process of nationalising the Reserve Bank. So those are the main policy outcomes that we had. In the weeks since, and it's been a very short time period since, but in the weeks since we have had a few important events. So first, Jacob Zuma, under what we believe was significant pressure from Ramaphosa, has announced the appointment of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. It was announced the evening before the first meeting of the NEC and was likely a calculated move to shore up his position as president. It prevented him being hammered for it at the NEC meeting, which I think was very important. As I said, we've had a significant focus on party unity. So you've seen Dlamini Zuma in KwaZulu-Natal giving speeches alongside Ramaphosa. She always said she would campaign for the ANC and support whoever won, and she's been showing that that's actually what she's going to do. The unity also comes into Ramaphosa's January 8th statement, confusingly given on January 13th. But it was a statement given at the ANC's 106th anniversary celebrations in the Eastern Cape. And the January 8th statement is intended by the ANC to provide the party with a way forward for 2018. So this was, he'd given one speech at the end of the conference, but that's a kind of, I've just won and I'm making a speech. This is much more, here's what we're planning for the next year. It was largely a restatement of his conference speech in terms of policy, and I'm calling it pragmatic populism, and I will discuss that in a little more detail shortly. He was a little stronger on corruption and state capture, which was great, but there was relatively little in the way of substance there. So the rhetoric was very strong, but in terms of what he was laying out, that was a little less obvious. He made a very big show of the fact that they're open for business. South Africa is open for business. This is going to be a pro-business government, is really the message he was trying to give. As I said, there was a significant focus on unity. But I think what Ramaphosa really used the January 8th statement to do was to clearly indicate his position as the rightful leader of the people of South Africa. And you've got to remember, at this point, we have what is called two centres of power. So we have Jacob Zuma as president of the country, and we have Cyril Ramaphosa as president of the governing party. And what Ramaphosa really tried to do was kind of shore up his position as president of the party and therefore of the future. So he spent a long time on the greetings. He made sure all social groups he could possibly mention in South Africa were mentioned. Crucially, and this is a real difference from Zuma, he spoke in a variety of languages. So Ramaphosa is Venda, and this is one of the minority groups, and he really has been emphasizing that, not in a way of making it a kind of an ethnic issue, but as a kind of, I don't represent one of the big groups, I just represent the people. But he spoke in Venda, but he also spoke in multiple other languages. So he was emphasizing both his position as a member of a minority group and his broad appeal to the people more broadly. So now looking ahead to the road to 2019, that's a kind of very, very quick run through of what's happened since December 16th. But what does this actually mean for the next 18 months in South Africa? So in terms of politics, I expect to see continued focus on party unity, hampering real reform. So I think it is incredibly important for the ANC to hold together as a party at the moment. And I think as a result, we're going to see the two factions reluctant to really push for big change. I'm expecting significant policy uncertainty, again, as the different factions within the ANC continue to pull the party in two directions. Continuing scandals, this is perhaps unsurprising for anybody who spends a lot of time in South African politics, but I think Mabuza and Magashule in particular have a number of skeletons in their closets. We're already beginning to see some of those coming out, but they're likely to be exposed in the run-up to the elections. In terms of the tripartite alliance, going into this elective conference, there were big concerns about whether the tripartite alliance would hold. The SACP has already started fielding its own candidates in some of the by-elections and local elections, and there was the real fear of a split. But I think the tripartite alliance will hold going forward, but with increasing demands from the alliance partners for a bigger say in decision-making. I think the SACP in particular is likely to continue to explore the possibility of fielding its own candidates, and will probably threaten that quite a lot if it feels that the ANC is going in the wrong direction. Key issues to watch over the next 18 months. The first, and I think the one that is on everybody's mind, is the question of Zuma's position. And I think for the ANC, this really comes down at the moment to the question of whether they would be more damaged by going into the 2019 elections with Zuma as a president and all the liabilities that he brings with them, or as a split party. I think he's currently unlikely to resign himself. I think his personality has shown that he's really quite keen to stay in power. And I think the ANC has serious concerns about a split. We saw it coming into the Elective Conference, and I think we've seen it in all of the speeches that have been given since. Unity is really key. So at the moment, I think the desire for unity is going to hold out. Zuma's a liability, but with Ramaphosa as the clear candidate for 2019, I think the threat of a party split at the moment is a bigger danger. And as I say, I think we can see this clearly in some of the current focus, but this could change, and I think it could change for two reasons. The first is if Zuma refuses to be reined in by Ramaphosa and makes him look weak. So that goes back to his announcement at the beginning of the Elective Conference of fee-free education, if he continues to do that sort of thing. So you're looking ahead at State of the Nation address. When he gives his State of the Nation address, does he follow the party line? Does he announce the things the party want him to? Or does he go out on a limb and start to announce policy that undermines other things going on in government? I think if he does that, he's going to be very quickly moved out. And the second thing, and this is perhaps the more likely, is that his position as president might be made untenable. This could be either through the State Capture Commission, once it's set up, depending on what the terms of the inquiry are and how quickly it moves, or given that we've now got a new head of the NPA coming in, if the NPA reinstates the 783 charges against him, I think it becomes increasingly untenable to have him. But I think if he's left as he is, he's actually not that big a threat to Ramaphosa, and he's certainly less of a threat, I think, than a split party. A split party is highly unlikely to do well at the next elections. Tied into the above is the two centres of power problem, which comes from the fact, as I said, that the ANC currently has one president in the country, another. So Ramaphosa has been clear that as president of the ANC, he should now be calling the shots politically. He's made several statements in which he said there's no two centres of power problem, the ANC is the centre of power. Zuma, however, is keen to still be seen as politically central. And you saw this at the ANC's anniversary celebrations. So he insisted on a seat among the new top six, rather than sitting in the VIP section with the other former leaders of the ANC. And bear in mind, this was an ANC anniversary, this wasn't a government event. And he also photobombed the traditional champagne picture. He doesn't drink, he's a known teetotaler, but he, grabbed his champagne and jumped in the picture, much to the surprise of a lot of the other members of the top six in there. So I think he's showing that he really does still want to be seen as politically important. And this could pose a problem for Ramaphosa. And as I said, this might be a reason Ramaphosa does need to get rid of him. My guess, though, is that we're going to see some rutting between the two, especially over the next couple of months, but that gradually Zuma is likely to appear, at least on the surface, to let Ramaphosa take some of the reins. I think he's shown so far that he's very, very keen to stay in power. He's prepared to backtrack, he's prepared to do U-turns, he's prepared to refuse to have anything to do with the allegations of state capture and then to announce the Commission of Inquiry. So I think it's possible that he will, if he thinks there's a good chance of him staying in power, at least on the surface, appear to let Ramaphosa take the reins. Another key issue to watch over the next 18 months is state capture. So as mentioned, Zuma's now appointed the Commission of Inquiry, and the scandal's not going away anytime soon. It's every day, if you read one of the newspapers, there's something new on state capture. Most of the newspapers now have a state capture watch section of their newspapers. It's going to go on, it's going to continue to be a problem. The big thing to watch over the next 18 months is what the terms of inquiry are. Does it just include the kind of smaller, reduced set of state capture allegations, or is it allowed to go wider? The National Prosecuting Authority. So again, as I said, we've got a new head of the National Prosecuting Authority coming into place, going to be chosen by Ramaphosa. And once that happens, the question of the charges against Zuma again rear their head. At present, I'm not sure either side in the ANC are out for blood on this, but the EFF and the DA certainly are. They're going to push very hard for these charges to be reinstated. And if Zuma becomes a thorn in Ramaphosa's side, I think that's likely to be the chosen method of assassination, if you will. I think this is going to be the easiest way to get him out. And finally, up here, having just come from Cape Town, I couldn't leave it off, the Cape Town water crisis. Currently, we have day zero, so the day the city runs out of water is late April. And this is politically not a huge issue for the ANC, but the reason I've put it up as something to watch politically is it's hugely problematic for the DA. So it's created some problems in the DA, which I'll discuss shortly, but with allegations of mismanagement against the DA, and particularly the Mayor, Patricia de Lille, in the very location that the DA have always held up as proof that they can manage things better than the ANC. This has always been there. We can manage the country better than the ANC, just look at the Western Cape. It's got roads and no potholes and all of this. This is actually a huge problem for the DA. It's undermining them. We've seen yesterday and today, the ANC are now beginning to raise questions about it in Parliament. We're getting demands for all sorts of documents coming out, and it looks like Patricia de Lille might actually lose her job over this. So not a huge problem for the ANC, but a huge problem for the DA. In terms of foreign policy, generally little substantive change expected here. I think the biggest expected changes are that the government's radical anti-colonial and anti-imperial rhetoric is likely to be downplayed slightly. The decision to withdraw from the ICC, which has already run into all sorts of roadblocks and sort of been put on the back burner anyway, but I think it's likely to be put well on the back burner. The Ramaphosa crowd were opposed to this from the beginning. I don't think a great deal is going to happen there. And then I think commercial engagement with Africa is likely to increase. Ramaphosa has been very clear that he wants to increase the amount of trade that South Africa does with the rest of the continent. So I think that's going to be the biggest change there. Moving on to security. So I think the next, in terms of political violence, unfortunately I think it is going to increase over the next 12 to 18 months in two particular places, so in Mpumalanga and especially KwaZulu-Natal. So in Mpumalanga, as already mentioned, is Didi Mabuza's home province. There's been increasing reports of assassinations, of kind of groups of thugs roaming around disrupting things. I think that's likely to continue. KwaZulu-Natal, I think, is going to be the bigger problem. It remains severely divided as a province. So the Provincial Executive Committee has been dissolved and an interim power-sharing committee is due to be formed. But you've got Senzo Mchunu and Sileze Kalala on either side, and they're both prepared to fight hard. Mchunu's allies in particular are likely to be out for blood after the elective conference, in which he was widely seen as having been cheated out of a position in the top 6. And part of the problem we're going to see in KwaZulu-Natal, and I think this morning I checked the news and there'd already been another 3 assassinations of local councillors in the KwaZulu-Natal region. But the real problem at the moment is we now have for the first time, no KwaZulu-Natal representative in the top 6. So there's nobody with any real legitimacy to intervene in KwaZulu-Natal, to get the different sides to the table. You've got to go further down the slate for that, and I think that's going to be a problem. And I think the party is well aware of this. As I say, they've formed they're forming an interim power-sharing committee. And before the January 8th statement, which is, as always, given in the Eastern Cape, you saw most of the top 6 go to KwaZulu-Natal. They went, and Dlamini Zuma was there as well. A real attempt to try and calm things down there. But I think we're going to see increased political violence there. Protests are also likely to increase. Again, for those of you who follow South African news, in the run-up to election, this has become almost inevitable. So service delivery protests are almost certainly going to increase. Public sector workers are also likely to protest. They're agitating at the moment for significant wage increases, and the government's just not going to be able to afford them, partly because it was already in financial constraints, but now they also have to find a way of paying for fee-free education. So public sector workers are likely to be protesting. And finally, students. The students have been protesting on and off since about 2015 in quite substantial levels. But this is likely to be more problematic now. They're likely to be left confused and frustrated by Zuma's promise of fee-free education. And this is discontent that we've already seen the EFF trying to stoke and turn into violence. So at the moment, various universities are in the process of registering students for the next academic year, and the EFF has been encouraging students who haven't been accepted to turn up as walk-in students on the day and try and get registered, on the basis that now it's fee-free education. They would have gone if they could have afforded it. They couldn't afford it, now they can, so they should go. So I think we're likely to see increased protests on that as Ramaphosa tries to deal with how he can fund it. Bits get pulled back, various things change. I think that's likely to be problematic. Economically, I'm expecting a modest recovery, although I think policy uncertainty is going to continue to threaten growth in the long run. So this goes back to the policy at the beginning. I think we've seen it for the last year, and I think it's going to continue this back and forth between the patronage faction and the reform faction. You get somebody making a policy, it kind of goes a little way there, then it's often another department will put kind of the brakes on it for some reason. So the mining industry does certain things, or the Department of Mines, and then the Treasury comes in and pulls a little bit back. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and that's going to threaten growth in the long run. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're likely to see pragmatic populism dominate economic policy. So I think we're going to have a lot of strong rhetoric. So this is a lot of the rhetoric around radical socioeconomic transformation, or around land expropriation without compensation. I think we're going to see a lot of rhetoric around that, but I think we're going to see relatively weak implementation of these more radical approaches. That's actually not that unusual in the run-up to an election anyway. Parties tend to go out onto the various sides, and you tend to see a lot of populist policies. But I think the tensions between the reformists and the patronage faction mean that this is going to be the dominant economic policy for the next 12 to 18 months. Some key issues to watch here over the next 18 months. We've got the Moody's ratings review coming in February. And although the markets reacted quite positively to Cyril Ramaphosa's election as president, I think Moody's have been very cautious in their response to that. And I think if Jacob Zuma and the finance minister, Malusi Gigabo, who's increasingly shown he's out of his depth on some of this, I think if they both remain in place, a downgrade has to be highly likely. We've also got I'm going to do it in a slightly different order, but the Mining Charter Court Review, again, February 2018. So this is the Chamber of Mines had asked the High Court to take a look at the mining charter. They wanted some clarification on things around once empowered, always empowered. Various other parts of it have been argued to be unconstitutional. Whatever the outcome of that particular review, I think the mining industry is unfortunately highly unlikely to see a finalised mining charter this year, meaning continuing policy uncertainty for the industry. Again, I think the court is likely to make some clarification. It may decide some bits need to go back to be reviewed. They'll go back to Minister Zwane. He's likely to be strongly caught up in the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. You're likely to see Treasury and the Department of Mines continue to butt heads on this. And I don't think at the moment you have enough strength at the top of the slate to really drive anything through. And finally, reform of state-owned enterprises. So, as I'm sure most of you know, there's been a huge problem in the state capture allegations around state-owned enterprises. Organisations like ESCOM have been used as part of this giving out of patronage. You've had people put into positions who can't manage them. You've had money coming out. You've got the trillion KPMG scandal that's just in the process of just broken-ish. And the ANC Elective Conference resolved that only skilled and qualified people should be appointed to lead state-owned enterprises, which is concerning that needed a new statement, but it's made a statement, and that's a clear challenge to the state capture. But at the moment, we still have Public Enterprises Minister Lynn Brown in place, and as long as she is, I think we're unlikely to see any real change there, because she clearly has no interest in good governance. There's too much that she's benefiting from with the way things are at the moment. Moving on now to look at the opposition parties. As we move to look at the election itself, these obviously come in a key. So the DA is currently struggling with problems. It's struggling with problems in two areas. So you've got in the Western Cape, and as I said, this is particularly around Patricia de Lille and the management of the water crisis. You've also got problems now in Gauteng, where the DA mayor, Herman Mashaba, has suspended and effectively removed his finance head amid claims of nepotism, conflict of interest, and price fixing. I think for the DA, this could go either way. If they can deal with these in a strong way in the next 2 to 3 months, they're going to be able to begin campaigning on a strong footing, and they're going to be able to continue to claim that they are the party that can root this out, that when they had allegations of nepotism and conflict of interest, that when they had mismanagement of the city, they dealt with it. If they're not, and at the moment they're showing... They seem to be a little stuck. They're not showing great leadership on this. If they're not, it's likely to cause them more problems in the run-up to the elections. And then we have the EFF. And I think the EFF needs to redefine itself a little now that its anti-Zuma stance is less powerful. So Julius Malema has made a name for himself and a lot of political hay opposing Jacob Zuma. He's been at the forefront of charges on state capture. He's been at the forefront of charges on Candler. And that's done very well for him. But now, even if Zuma's still president, his control and his power has been reduced slightly because you now have Ramaphosa, who can also come out against Zuma. And so the EFF needs to redefine itself a little. I think as they do this, as they start to redefine themselves, we're likely to see some increased radicalism. So we've already seen an increased kind of push on things like the land expropriation, on things like radical economic reform. That's the direction that they're likely to go in. And the more concerning part for the EFF might be that we also seem to be seeing an encouragement of protests and violence as part of this. So just in the last sort of week or so, we've seen quite violent protests at H&M stores across South Africa, and also this encouragement of the disruption at the university registrations. So they've really been coming out and calling for protests and violence. And I think that that's likely to continue as they start to work out who they are in a kind of world without Zuma. So, the election outcome. As long as the ANC can hold itself together over the next 18 months, and again, I think that's going to be crucial to decisions they're making, I think the ANC is likely to win outright, but with quite a significantly reduced majority, so in the low 50s rather than the low 60s. I think we're likely to see a small DA increase in line with the kind of increases they've seen over the past years, and a more significant EFF increase. The province of Gauteng is going to be key. And it is possible, I think this is the province that the ANC is most likely to lose, and that we're going to end up with a coalition at the provincial level. And that raises, as coalitions always do, some interesting questions, because the kingmakers in that are going to be the EFF, and it's who the EFF decide they want to go into a coalition with. And finally, just to sort of end, some key upcoming events. And this is more just for interest than anything else, but I think these are the kind of key points to look at over the next 18 months. As you'll see, an awful lot of them are in February. February is going to be a really key month in South Africa. So we've got the State of the Nation address. If Jacob Zuma is still in his position, then I think that's where you're really going to see the relationship between him and Ramaphosa. How much has Ramaphosa actually been able to rein in policy-wise? We've then got the budget, shortly after the State of the Nation address. Again, particularly with fee-free education, it's going to be a really key budget. How is the government going to do this? Are they going to be able to do it? Are they going to have to pull back on some of their promises? The Moody's rating review again in February. The High Court review of the latest iteration of the mining charter that I mentioned, that's currently also scheduled for February. It was previously scheduled for early December, but was moved back to February because there was a belief that there wasn't going to be long enough to do it in the December scheduling. And then the sort of final thing that I think is going to be key is the decision of the Rules Committee of the National Assembly. So the Rules Committee of the National Assembly have been tasked with coming up with a set of rules about how to deal with the impeachment of a sitting president. So what counts as gross misconduct, and how does that proceed? That's going to be key, because if Zuma won't resign himself, and if he becomes a liability to the ANC, more of a liability than I think he is at the moment, impeachment is likely to be the way they have to go. So it's going to be really important that those rules come out with something that gives the ANC the wiggle room to impeach him if they want, but probably that also doesn't, on the face of it, mean they have to impeach him. So it's not quite enough for them to, it to be untenable to keep him. Okay, that's me.